On June 28th, 1919, in a hall of mirrors outside Paris, a group of men signed a piece of paper meant to end all future wars. Instead, it planted the seeds for the deadliest conflict in human history, one that would begin exactly 20 years and 2 months later. This is the story of how a peace treaty broke a nation, how that broken nation found a man willing to promise it greatness again, and how the world watched it happen and did almost nothing to stop it. To understand 1939, you have to start in 1918. World War I had just ended. 4 years of trench warfare that killed roughly 20 million people and left Europe economically gutted. Germany hadn't been invaded. Its army hadn't been destroyed on the field. But by November 1918, it was starving, exhausted, and politically collapsing. The Kaiser abdicated. A new government sued for peace, and the guns fell silent. This mattered enormously for what came next. Many Germans didn't feel defeated. They felt betrayed. The army hadn't lost battles so much as the home front had collapsed. This idea would curdle into something called the stab-in-the-back myth, the belief that Germany's military was undefeated in the field, but was betrayed by politicians, socialists, and Jews back home. It was false. But false ideas can be incredibly powerful when people are desperate to explain a humiliation. In January 1919, the victorious powers gathered in Paris to decide Germany's fate. Notably absent from the table, Germany itself. The terms were negotiated by Britain, France, the United States, and Italy, then presented to German delegates as something closer to an ultimatum than a negotiation. The Treaty of Versailles, signed that June, did 3 things that would shape the next 2 decades. First, territory. Germany lost about 13% of its land and all of its overseas colonies. Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. A strip of land called the Polish Corridor cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany. The industrial Saar region went under League of Nations control. Second, military restrictions. The German army was capped at 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, no tanks. The Rhineland was demilitarized, meaning German troops couldn't even be stationed on German soil near the French border. Third, and this is the one that mattered most emotionally, reparations. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war. The reparations bill that followed was almost incomprehensibly large. 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly the entire German gross national product, spread over decades. When the terms were published, the reaction in Germany was less about specific clauses and more about the sheer humiliation of it. This wasn't a negotiated peace between equals. It was a diktat, a dictated settlement. German delegates called it a national disgrace. One German newspaper wrote that vengeance would come for the shame of 1919. Nobody at the table could have known how literally that would come true. The new German government, democratic, parliamentary, headquartered in the town of Weimar, inherited this mess. The Weimar Republic, as it came to be known, was in an almost impossible position from day one. It had to accept a treaty most Germans despised, while also trying to build a functioning democracy out of a country with no democratic tradition. deep political divisions and paramilitary groups from both the far left and far right fighting in the streets. In 1919 and 1920 alone, the young republic survived a communist uprising in Berlin and a right-wing coup attempt called the Kapp Putsch. Political assassinations became disturbingly common. This was not a stable foundation. Then came 1923, and things got worse. Germany fell behind on reparations payments. In response, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to extract payment directly in coal and goods. The German government's response was passive resistance, telling workers to strike rather than cooperate, and printing money to pay them while they did. This is where hyperinflation enters the story, and it's hard to overstate how surreal it got. In January 1923, a loaf of bread cost around 250 marks. By November of that year, it cost 200 billion marks. People carried cash in wheelbarrows. Workers were paid twice a day because prices changed by the hour. Photographs from the period show children playing with stacks of now worthless banknotes like building blocks, and people literally burning currency for warmth because it was cheaper than firewood. For the German middle class especially, the people who had savings, pensions, insurance policies, this was catastrophic. A lifetime of careful saving could be wiped out in weeks. That kind of economic trauma doesn't just fade once the currency stabilizes. It leaves scar tissue, and it left millions of Germans looking for someone to blame, and someone who could promise it would never happen again. Here's where the story briefly seems to turn a corner. From roughly 1924 to 1929, Germany experienced what's sometimes called the golden years of Weimar. A new currency stabilized the economy. American loans, under a plan negotiated by diplomat Charles Dawes, helped Germany restructure its reparations payments and rebuild industry. Berlin became a genuine cultural capital, famous for its nightlife, its art, its cinema. But this recovery had a hidden weakness. It was built substantially on foreign, mostly American, credit. Germany was borrowing to pay reparations and using new loans to service old debts. It was a structure that only worked as long as the money kept flowing in. It didn't keep flowing. In October 1929, the New York stock market crashed. American banks, suddenly desperate for cash, called in their loans, including the ones propping up the German economy. The fragile recovery collapsed almost overnight. By 1932, German unemployment had climbed past 6 million people, roughly a quarter of the workforce. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, and once again, a generation that had already lived through hyperinflation and a lost war watched their economic security disappear. This is the environment a small far-right party had been waiting for. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, had been a fringe movement through most of the 1920s. In the 1928 election, they won less than 3% of the vote. But the party's message was built for exactly this kind of crisis. It blamed Germany's humiliation on the Versailles Treaty, blamed the economic collapse on a mix of foreign creditors and internal enemies, communists, and central to Nazi ideology, Jewish people. And it promised strength, order, and national revival. As the Depression deepened, that message stopped sounding fringe to millions of desperate Germans. In the July 1932 election, the Nazi Party became the largest party in the German parliament, the Reichstag. they still didn't have a majority. Democracy in Weimar was fracturing into a multi-party gridlock that made stable government nearly impossible. Behind closed doors, conservative politicians around the aging President Hindenburg made a fateful calculation. They believed they could bring Hitler into government as chancellor, hem him in with conservative ministers around him, and control him. On January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. They were catastrophically wrong about being able to control him. Within weeks, a fire that gutted the Reichstag building gave Hitler the pretext to suspend civil liberties. Within months, an enabling act let his government pass laws without parliamentary approval. Within a year and a half, following Hindenburg's death, Hitler had merged the roles of president and chancellor into a single title, Führer. None of this made the Second World War inevitable in some mystical sense. There were decisions at every step that could have gone differently. A less punitive treaty, a more robust global response to the Depression, different choices by German conservatives in 1933. But by the time Hitler stood as Chancellor in early 1933, the pieces were arranged in a deeply dangerous configuration. A nation humiliated by peace, ruined by inflation, gutted by depression, and now led by a man who had spent a decade telling it exactly who to blame and exactly what he intended to do about it. In the next episode, we'll look at how that man consolidated total power inside Germany and how a similar story of national humiliation and economic desperation was playing out 6,000 miles away in Italy and in Japan. This is where the road to war really begins. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive, let me know in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.